This is the church planter point for week 5. The topic is preaching the gospel, and I've been tasked with the sharing of back to the Young Life model that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And I want to talk about some strengths and weaknesses of the Young Life model, and then I'd like to talk about maybe imagination widening perspective on what preaching the gospel actually looks like from a biblical sense. So firstly, with the Young Life model, it's the model that I heard the gospel through and decided to become a Christian through. So personally, it was very effective in my life. I was a 17-year-old adolescent. I'm not sure how effective that would still be for me as a 35-year-old man, but nonetheless, it's been effective for a lot of years across time, especially with teenagers. And the model goes something like this. We would do a series of talks within clubs, which is a weekly club in Young Life, and we do a talk. Let's say there's 10 weeks of club in one semester, and then 10 weeks of club in another semester. So we'd plan out 10 weeks of talks, and almost every time it would go God as creator. God created us good. And then the inbreaking of sin. And so there'd be reflections on falling short of the creation that we were created to be. And then we'd move into numerous discussions on Jesus through the Gospels for the most point. So we talk through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the life of Jesus. And then we do work on the cross and what the cross was doing with our sin. And then we would do work basically on Easter. We would share the Easter narrative and the hope of Christ conquering sin in order that we might be in right relationship with God. There were pretty familiar images that people have used across time in the midst of these talks. For instance, the one image where we're on one side of a cliff and God's on the other side of the cliff, and there's a big chasm in between, and the cross intersects that chasm so that we can again be in relationship with God. You may have seen that one along the way. But yeah, this series of talks, the way to present the gospel to teenagers, goes the same at Young Life camps over the course of a week, and also in most Young Life clubs across time. So as you're getting to know me a little bit, at least through these videos, equations and plug-and-plays across various contexts, I think have some strengths and weaknesses. The strength would be you're given a template to at least begin to describe what you want to accomplish. But the weakness is that Jesus obviously shared and lived the gospel in different ways as he came across different people, as did the apostles as they crossed numerous contexts in the book of Acts and then the epistles that followed. So I personally love that Young Life model because it was so effective in my life, but it is just a model, and there are numerous ways to proclaim the gospel. When I look at the biblical narrative on proclaiming the gospel, especially through the lens of the book of Acts, I see something very different than what we accomplish today. I see a public proclamation of the gospel. I see the proclamation happening in the public square, and today I see oftentimes churches imagining the proclamation of the gospel happening within our church buildings during worship services. To me, this is a huge problem and a huge contrast that our church has been working to resolve across time. One example for you, as we have tried to do public proclamation, is an event that we started called the Homebrew Competition. So in our city, something that's very popular now and growing in popularity is beer. So I'm in Los Angeles. I'm originally from Michigan, and to me, Michigan understands beer. When I got to Los Angeles, I was surprised at the lack of beer that was here, mostly because we're in California and there's lots of wine here. Well, over the last 5 years, people's passion for beer has been growing. And one of those people who makes beer came to me one time. He has nothing to do with our church. We're just friends. And he said, "Hey, man, I want to give to your church, but I don't have any money, and I really don't want anything to do with your church." And I thought, the layers of pain that are behind that comment. But whatever, I went with him. I said, "Sure, it's great." I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" He said, "So here's what I do. I make beer, and I would love to be able to share my beer with your church." And I said, "All right, let's figure this out." So we started an event where we gather people who make beer. We call them artisans because we believe that they are artisans, making the next round of beers for this next culture. And we gather everyone together, and we have people share about the beers that they make, their process, their potential breweries that they're starting. A lot of these people are in the process of planning to make breweries. And then we have one of our friends who's an urban monk come and talk about the robust history of beer in the church. We lament what happened in the 20th century with regard to perspectives on alcohol through the church, and we talk about how that's not a historical perspective on beer in the church. And then we have someone from our church publicly in a bar in the middle of Atwater Village in Los Angeles proclaim the gospel to everyone who's come. The stories that have come out of this have been remarkable. I feel very grateful for them, and it's inspired me to continue to think, how do we do this publicly? How do we share the gospel in the public square? We've talked earlier about personal evangelism, which I appreciate and is one form of sharing in the public square, especially as opposed to just sharing within the church building. But yeah, how might you be able to proclaim the gospel in the public square? And I'm not talking about like bullhorns or making ridiculous signs and standing on street corners. I'm talking about contextual, pneumatologically driven, Holy Spirit laced proclamation of the gospel that makes sense for your city. How do you do that? How do we also not just do that as leaders, but how do we equip the people in our churches to be doing that as well? That's the leadership question that I'm mostly interested in these days. So yeah, I hope that gives you some food for thought from a church planting point. Young Life model, great template, probably needs to be translated across contexts. And then public proclamation of the gospel like we see biblically, rather than these privatized in the safety of our own church building proclamations. Get some stuff praying and moving in your brain and your heart and see what comes up. Have a good week.